Free Speech Zone. Here's your host, Eric Barnard.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Free Speech Zone. I am your host, Eric Barnard. We're coming to you from the studios of Atlanta Podcast Recording. Got a very special guest with us today. We have State Representative Brenda Lopez Romero. She is a candidate for Georgia's 7th Congressional District. She's going to be here to talk to us today about her campaign, what she hopes to accomplish should she be elected, and we're going to talk a little bit of everything here. We're going to talk the Green New Deal. We're going to talk gun safety. We're going to talk school choice. We're going to talk about impeachment, and we're going to talk about what she hopes to accomplish her first day in Washington. We're looking forward to this conversation, and thank you all for joining us here today. It's an honor to have Representative Romero here with us. Welcome to the show. It's a privilege to have you here. So my first question to you is, why are you running for Congress? Why did you decide to make the leap and to run for this seat?
Well, I really have what I have categorized into three reasons why I ultimately decided to run for office. One of them is a personal reason in the fact that I have been doing, I guess in the personal capacity part, I'm a current state representative, as you mentioned earlier, but I say that's been a great privilege from the history of having migrated to the United States. I came specifically here to Georgia when I was 5 years old to reunite with my father, and eventually, both of my parents are working class. Both of them had less than elementary school education. But, being able to, my father, I remember telling me when I was young that I had two options in life. I could either work or go to school. And so, always pushing for me to be able to better myself educationally, to be able to advance and have better opportunities for myself. And ultimately, I went to college. Ultimately, I went to law school to be first in my family to do so. And so I've always kind of worked in that capacity of all the great opportunities that we do have here in the United States, and kind of pursuing that America promise that we kind of see reinvigorated every new generation that we have here in the United States. So I bring all that up because, I do take as a personal affront to a certain sense what's happening at the national level with the national rhetoric under this administration, and the lack of simply, not being able to share one's stories to be able to move good policy forward. So I definitely do see it in a in that personal sense, that constant sense of duty that I've had to be able to provide my story as an opportunity to show what we can be and where we can go. On the profession, that kind of gets interrelated a little bit with what I call the professional reasons for running for office. And that is not only my state representative, I'm an immigration attorney, having done a lot of advocacy work, quite frankly, since I was in college. So for the last 15 years or so, I've been involved with nonprofit organizations doing advocacy lobbying work around the issues of voting rights access, also with laws or legislation that may have discriminatory impact, and obviously immigrant right issues here in the state of Georgia specifically. Mm-hmm. And so beyond that, in terms of personal educational capacity, I've done all of my education, and sort of the real sort of my wheelhouse of policy is federal international affairs kind of work. Undergrad was political science, but I did a concentration in international affairs, despite the fact that I thought I was going to go to law school specifically. Mm-hmm. And even in law school, I ended up doing a specialization in national security and counterterrorism law. And quite frankly, when I was younger, when I was in college, one of my ideas of what I would do in the future would be go to the United Nations and work in some sort of international development, international affairs, or non-governmental organization. Right. And so that's really kind of the wheelhouse of work. And I see that obviously running for Congress, I think it's important to have someone that has a really good understanding, not only of what happens with us here locally in our state and in our district, or what is happening in our country and with federal issues, but also, what is happening outward facing, as we're a globalized society that we are. So I think that professionally, I'm a good fit across all the sectors and levels of work that a congressional person has to do and has to work at. And so those are really the main reason. One of the main reasons that I think are interrelated, my personal and professional aspects of my life. But ultimately, sort of what finally made that final determination to run through this election cycle is what I call a practical reason. And that practical reason is that I quite frankly think that the 7th should have been flipped last year, and I was very disappointed that it wasn't. And I don't mean that from generally, we would have liked to have flipped it because we wanted it in the blue column, of course, but more in an objective kind of review about what happened in the 7th last cycle. And what happened in the 7th was that we had 5 House seats flipped, 1 Senate seat flipped, 2 county commissions, a school board, all of Gwinnett as a county, and also the solicitor's office for Gwinnett County, which is one of the 2 counties in the 7th, the vast majority of the portion that's part of the 7th, they all flipped and they all went blue.
Right.
Our adjacent congressional district, the 6th, which is actually tilts slightly more Republican, that was also able to be flipped.
Yes.
And then on our side, coming back to the 7th, Rob Woodall, the current representative, he specifically told AJC he had no reason to campaign, and he didn't. He did put forth no effort to do any sort of campaign. And, either that's overconfidence or unwilling to do the work. I think it was a combination of both. It doesn't matter. The point is that you had basically an opponent asleep at the wheel. And so when I took a look at the totality of all of those issues here in the 7th that happened, and sort of what I call would have been a perfect storm to have flipped that seat, and that we didn't, I was really disappointed. And I think that ultimately realizing that I have a great story to share and a great story to push, and one that is representative of the 7th. And I have the professional background to do the work necessary to be a good congressional member and a good elected official. I ultimately decided that also based on those 2 reasons, and the fact that I have been doing a lot of outreach and have a really good infrastructure at mobilizing grassroots efforts, I think that I'm better suited and have a better strategy at ultimately flipping the 7th, which is quite frankly ultimately what should be the goal for anybody in the 7th. So I think overall is a good summary of why I decided to run for Georgia 7th.
You certainly have got some experiences, and you certainly have a story, and I want to delve into that a little bit. So you immigrated to the United States at 5 years old. You came here to Georgia to reunite with your father. Tell me about your family's journey from where in Mexico were you from, and how did your father get to Georgia, and then soon after did y'all follow him?
Well, my father had been in the United States since the early 80s. Primarily in Texas, around the Houston, Pasadena area. And so somewhere around those early to mid 80s, I believe my father tells me his one of his brothers came here to Atlanta specifically because there was a growing need for construction. A lot of construction work was going on here in the state of Georgia. And so my father kind of followed him here, and that's how he got here to Georgia. At some time during the mid 80s, when President Ronald Reagan signed amnesty legislation that allowed for people to be able to apply for their green card here, that had been working and had established some community ties here to the United States. And because my dad applied for that, he was no longer able to come and go as he used to. That being said, I'm the youngest of 6, so that's why I came with my mom.
Wow.
And so our process of coming here at that point, didn't have sort of some of the complexities that we now see today, even though I do think about the fact that, I could have easily been the 5-year-old today that we've seen on television, right? Whether we've seen them floating in rivers, whether we've seen them behind cages. I mean, I know that personally, that by an absence of a couple of years, that could have been me as a 5-year-old child. And so that's why I say that that's very personal to me, the situations that I see happening at the federal level. Sure. And so, but that wasn't necessarily the case for me, because me and my mom were able to obtain a tourist visa to come visit my father, but ultimately he didn't want us to be far, away for so long while his process took place, and we overstayed our visa. and we've been here since. But even our process, through my father being able to have an option to be able to regularize his status, I didn't get my own green card, even though I was a first preference category as a minor child, until 12 years later. And so it wasn't until I was about 16, 17 years old and in high school, in my junior year of high school, that I eventually became a green card holder. And I also, that's a lot of the work that I've done, again, because like I had mentioned, education is so important to me. I've worked a lot with access to education, especially access to higher education, and promoting a pipeline into higher education through conferences and career days and things along those lines, that I've worked with different organizations in that capacity. And so I even now, in the context of, well, actually in college, when I started doing some of that work and started working with undocumented students here in Georgia at that time, and also eventually, DACA approved students. But the same thing, right? I mean, I tell folks, I didn't do anything special. I didn't earn it. I wasn't more skilled. I wasn't more worthy than any of sometimes my peers that did not have those legal opportunities that my father first had, that I eventually allowed him to petition for me.
Right.
But had my green card delayed a year or two more, and I would have been a senior, or I would have graduated, I might not have had an opportunity to continue on to college, or I might not have known that I did, like was the case for many young folks that I saw when I was in college myself, that despite some legal barriers, there were options, and there are some options, more limited, of course, but there are options to be able to continue on to college, but many young folks don't know that.
Right.
And so, I again, sort of, I say, if it just luck of the straw, right? Because had my green card come, a year later, I would have been exactly in that same situation.
Sure.
And did I know at that time that was happening? No, I didn't, right? Things were just happening on their own as history progressed. And eventually, so I did become a green card holder, went on to college, and understanding how valuable it was to continue to do the work, to advocate on behalf of people that are more marginalized, that don't have the same level or have very few recourse and or access to opportunities, whether that be legal access, whether that be education access, which has been sort of my two major capacities that I've worked in. Ultimately, I knew that I was going to go to law school. And so when I applied for law school, I also applied to become a U.S. citizen.
Mm-hmm.
Because I thought that, it was important, right? That's what I tell folks about the difference between being a naturalized citizen, is that you have to choose to become a citizen.
Right.
You have to, choose to want to be a civic citizen of this country, and having that as a conscious thought actually gives you, to sometimes, not always, but sometimes a higher sense of ownership about the responsibility that you have to this country.
Sure.
To uphold its values, and to uphold also who you are as a person. And that's a little bit more of the story about my process in the immigration context.
Sure. And what year did you become an American citizen?
In 2008.
2008. So it took you 12 years to get a green card. You and your mother came over here on a tourist visa. You overstayed the visas, you stated. Why does this process take so long? And one of the things that I'm reading about right now is that immigration courts currently have a backlog of over 1 million cases. People trying to, whether that's to obtain asylum, whether it's to get a green card, just to go through the proper channels of becoming a citizen. The backlog's over 1 million people. So 2 questions on this. Why did it take you so long to get a green card and to begin the application process to become a citizen finally? And 2, what do you think of the current U.S. immigration system with these courts backlogged over 1 million people?
Well, here's the thing. That the simple answer is this, and one of the things with my experience is that the only reason that we have that backlog is because the laws are antiquated. The laws are also set to not allow for, I guess what we would say, like a supply demand, right? If we want to talk about it in a market sense, to not allow the demand met by supply, right? By having these artificial quotas. And so, for example, at that time when I was processing, my father also was still a green card holder. And so green card holders, despite them petitioning for immediate family, which is their spouses and children under 21, I still have long waits. And so my father actually naturalized in 2008 when I did as well. And so that it's just sort of, that is how the laws are written, that causes this backlog. Not that it needs to be that way, but it is that way simply because the law causes those backlogs. Now, that is generally in terms of what it used to take generally to process, right? Now what we're seeing is also the current administration through its power over the executive agencies that have caused an additional artificial backlog and artificial delay and artificial also just lack of functionality. As an immigration attorney, I speak to this, from the practicing end of having to work with clients, and what we were able to do, or the things that would take, one of the most egregious things, for example, is people that have been victims of certain violent crimes may be eligible to apply for certain protections that give them some amount of status called a U visa. Mm-hmm. And before 2016, those cases were being decided and processed within about a year of filing. Now we're at about over 5 years delay.
Wow!
Just to get a decision. Someone that has been victimized of a crime.
Wow!
And so again, that has nothing to do with the law. That has to do with the administration aspect of the agency. It started off obviously with the fact that many individuals, quite frankly, civil servants decided not to continue working after this new administration came in. That's a little part of it. The other part also is that there was hiring freezes. Right. And the second part is that, there's been a lot of moving around and prioritizing heavy dragnet enforcement, right, versus prioritizing processing people that do have some sort of eligibility to be able to regularize their status. And the same thing with the context of the courts, right? We have, of course, always had delays in the last 10 plus years that I've been practicing, or that I've been working in the legal field. Even before being an attorney, I was a paralegal. And so we've always had delays, but the extraordinary amount.
So the delays, as you said, you've had delays in the past, but these delays are now becoming longer. They're being prolonged, and it's not due to one thing. It's due to the fact that, one, you have changes in the administration. You have the lack of manpower to push cases through, civil service not working, the hiring freeze, so there's not people come in to replace them to get these cases to move forward, and it just clearly it's a outcome that's a result of multiple factors. It's not simply just one thing, but with this backlog and with the changes that need to be made to probably steam this along, if you are elected and you do go to Congress, what do you want to see changed and fix our immigration system?
I am a big believer in not reinventing the wheel. And having an experience in this advocacy work and knowing what we've been doing both at the federal government level and also at the state legislature, that's important because I want to remind people, and the conversation that I want to have is that we were in 2012, 2013 really close to passing comprehensive immigration reform.
Yeah, the DREAM Act.
No. Comprehensive immigration reform. That included a portion of DREAM Act. So that wouldn't have just applied to current, potential DREAM Act recipients. Mm-hmm. That would have been a holistic regularization program, which would have probably regularized somewhere. The estimates were between 8 to 9 million of the 11 million unauthorized individuals in the country that was considered at that point for us to have had. It's dropped down to about 10 million now. Okay. That would have been. That's why it's comprehensive immigration reform.
Understood.
And so, it was one of those bills that was compromised enough where basically all the groups were not that happy, but they were okay with it. And usually that means it's a good thing, right?
Sure.
And so it passed on the U.S. House side and it failed to pass on the Senate side by about 6 or 7 votes. And so what I want to do in terms of that contest is make sure that we go back to this piece of legislation that we already had, that we had already agreed. And quite frankly, many of the people that voted on that bill at that point in time are still in Congress, both in the Senate and in the House. And so I think that's why it's important to have someone that has negotiated all her life through conversations, through building relationships, through building coalitions, compromise, and sometimes consensus. Right. And I understand that this is how you get work done. I tell folks I don't believe in bringing, the DC buzzwords or the DC talking points to Georgia. Definitely not to the 7th. Right. I'm interested in figuring and doing the work that's necessary here in the 7th and bringing those issues and those concerns to DC.
Okay, that's a very good, and certainly someone with your background as an immigration attorney, more than a decade of experience working in this area would be beneficial, especially now, and actually know how the system works and not having to worry about the it getting politicized because you understand the issue with real world experience in it. But there's been a lot of anger over the immigration policies of this administration with the catching and the permanent holding of children, especially. Do you support these calls to abolish ICE, the Immigration Customs Enforcement Agency? Do you support that?
Well, see, that could go back to sort of my whole point about not liking DC buzzwords or these talking points or things that my question is, what do we mean? Do we mean that we need to have an enforcement arm in whatever name it may be called that is more compliant with international standards and international human rights norms? Absolutely. Did we have better oversight, for example, when it was under the INS and was, again, the issue here is not whatever the name of the organization is. It's who's running the organization, right? That's our real problem of why we see what we see now in some of the very what has become unconscionable situations that we've seen, especially young kids being subjected to, right? And so absolutely, if we need to revamp the agency, but in this case called ICE, that does the enforcement, absolutely we should, right? If it's necessary. But you're going to do that basically by ensuring that and one of the things as a congressional member that I would have is making sure that we have oversight about what work is being done, not only with the ICE agency, but any agency. And this is true now that we've seen concerns with the VA, for example. This is true when we see concerns within the Department of Education and how they're administering their student loans, for example, or regardless of what falls under any of the executive agencies. As a congressional member, our job is to keep oversight over the work they do. Right. And so, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You just have to make sure that you're consistently watching over them.
Sure. Absolutely makes that's the role of the Congress, especially with House Representatives. Y'all appropriate the funds for every agency, so you have every right to know, and the citizens have every right to know what the agency's doing and what they're allocating and how they're doing it exactly. On some other issues, especially going on right now that are important here in Georgia, issues over red flag laws that are being pushed now in Congress. Where do you stand on red flag laws and on these calls for banning certain types of weapons and on supporting gun rights? What is your stance on that?
Well, I want to start off by saying that the U.S. House, having the majority, has already done a lot of the work to promote gun safety and training, right? Because that's really what we're getting at. And these pieces of legislation that include some of the things that you've mentioned, right? Banning certain type of assault or military style weapons, definitely doing the red flag laws, being able to have universal background checks. All of these pieces of bills already passed on the U.S. House side, and they're pieces of legislation that I will be and would have been supportive of them, in terms of, where I am on that. So for me, I try to emphasize to people is not that we're trying to figure out what bills to pass, because those bills have already been passed on the U.S. House side. What we have to do is ensure that we continue to work on the electoral process and also flip the U.S. Senate so that those bills don't just go, become dead on arrival the moment that they pass the House side. And so, always insist that people know that this work has already been done to make sure that we have a far more responsible gun ownership.
And if these bills are passing the House, but they're dying over in the Senate, if you have a divided, if you're elected and you go there and and the Democrat Party maintains the majority in the House, but the Republicans maintain control of the U.S. Senate, it's going to be much harder to pass anything along the front of gun control, of any form of gun control legislation. It's going to be difficult to get anything passed in terms of dealing with climate change or education policy. It seems like every single bill gets gridlocked and there can't seem to be any form of agreement in both chambers on anything these days. Everything seems to be another continuing resolution or just nothing being done. What are your hopes of dealing with the gridlock that's going on? Do you plan to work with Republicans? Do you think you can work with Republicans in this climate?
So a couple answers to that. There's a lot of unknowns, right? Well, even if ultimately we did not flip the U.S. Senate, one additional alternative is also who is in the White House, right? Who in the White House matters a lot, especially with the senators. And I don't think that we would have we would have this same kind of gridlock if we ultimately also won back the White House. So that is a potential scenario, right, where we could actually move things forward if we stopped having whatever fiascos coming out of the White House currently, and some of that blockage that goes on that side. So there's a potential for that, right? Ultimately, we could have a split Congress, but if we take the White House back, then there's going to be some room for movement. Now, that is going to require what was your second question, which is working with all our colleagues in Congress, in the Senate and in the House. And I do believe that. And I will tell you from it's a personal experience working in the state legislature, not just the time, not these last 4 years that I've been elected, but actually since the 10 years before then, where I've been going as a private citizen, doing advocacy work with nonprofit organizations. The reason that we were able to, in many ways, the Georgia legislature has been predominantly, sometimes it's been supermajority Republican legislature for the last probably 12 years now. And so the reason that advocate organizations and individuals were ever able to either block a bill from moving forward or changing a bill so they would have less negative impact. Sometimes what I call some of the work that you do on the defense side is making a bad bill less bad, right? Whatever capacity of advocacy you were doing, the reason we were able to do that is because we built relationships with everyone, particularly those that in the majority, which in Georgia was Republicans for the last decade or so. And so and that's the work that I've come from, and that's the work that I believe in. That if you have these individual conversations, not in the media, because no one's going to budge in the media, especially if you're tweeting away, some mean messages about folks. That's just not how adults work. And that's not how professionals work either. And so my work has been to talk to folks. And as an elected official, I've had plenty of conversations with colleagues that are Republican. And and I will get, Brenda, I understand this is a bad policy. I understand this is a bad idea. I understand we shouldn't do this, but they feel they need to vote that way because of their constituency or perceived constituency of who would vote for them. But they are willing to work with us sometimes, at least to not get something moving forward or to minimize impact or improve of a bill. That's on the advocacy side, usually on the against side. But on the positive side, we've had a lot of opportunities to be able to find the common ground of what we do support together and push bills forward in that capacity, right? Because it doesn't have to be under my name if they're going to move forward a piece of bill, or if I agree with a piece of bill that we can move forward and just modify it for anything that might require changes. And so that's the type of work that I've done both as an advocate and now as an elected official. And obviously I have no reason to change, the way that I work once I'm in Congress.
Sure. Let me go over some of the things that I've been having some. After I announced that you were going to be on the podcast, quite a few people sent me questions wondering where you stood on some things. We've addressed two of them already: immigration and gun control. I have another question here. What policies do you support combating climate change, and do you support a policy such as the Green New Deal?
So here's with issues of climate change, I see that as a bottom up. Right. Most people's knee-jerk reaction at the congressional level will tell you to, we need to go back to the, Paris agreements. Mm-hmm. Not that we don't, and that would be good, absolutely, but that's not going to help us resolve some of the issues. Again, being a person that actually understands international affairs and international law, most of our accords, agreements, our treaties, our conventions, whatever we might call them, are what I call aspirational goals that government entities or government state actors basically mm-hmm. decide to say, hey, this is kind of a good framework, right? After that, then we need to ratify it through our Congress for them to actually become existing U.S. law. Other than that, they're just aspirational goals. And the reality is that most agreements, including the Paris Agreement, is just an aspirational framework. And so, absolutely, I agree with it. Absolutely, I think that we need to, come on back with the international world on this front. But I don't think that we're going to make as much meaningful impact unless we start working locally on the issues of climate change. And I think that that is the message that we need to continue moving forward on that. And what do I mean by that specifically? Especially, for example, here in the state of Georgia, and this should be relevant to whatever state, and it should be based on the industries and the needs of that state. But here in Georgia, for example, last year we had to come back for a special legislative session to basically provide funding for disaster relief for farmers in South Georgia after Hurricane Michael. Right. And now the farmers know that this is an issue that did not just happen last year and just was a fluke. Right. They understand that this is the new world that we live in. And so because of that, we have had, again, despite the fact that we might consider sometimes it's hard to get some of this kind of legislation passed with Republicans, the reality is that it has been Republicans that have been moving forward some bills. Again, it doesn't matter who gets credit. It matters, that things get moved forward. To ensure that there's, for example, we had a constitutional amendment bill that passed and then passed on the ballot that would have actually specifically earmarked conservation funding that is taxed, because otherwise money that's taxed just goes to the general fund. It may or may not be used for the program that it was initially intended, but this would have allowed for that. There has been several bills that have passed to protect our Georgia coastline from overdevelopment, from things such as, oyster farming. And we have to have that balance, right, between what the local industries need, how heavy the economy is based on some of these industries, and how much of that we can balance out with our ecological protection needs as well. And so who has been at the forefront of those have been the local communities most affected, right? And at that point, when you're the communities that are most affected, it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or Democrat anymore, because now your livelihood, your home is at risk. And so I think that in Georgia specifically, we can start having those conversations and we can start having changes. And that's what I would do as a congressional member. How that applies to me as a congressional member is that I think it's an important platform to have those conversations. We're starting to have more municipalities, for example, or more counties deciding to have their own standards of reducing or eliminating their carbon footprint, or engaging more in different uses of renewable energy, or divesting, for example, from petroleum industries. And so I think that is the work that I want to continue working as a congressional person, to be able to have this holistic approach at the local level and emphasize locally why these things matter to us here in Georgia, why they're important for us here in Georgia, and then move those. And I think that if states and local municipalities started doing that individually, I think that we would have a greater impact from that sort of local things happening coming up to the national level, right? Because those would be real concrete things to do versus, again, these aspirational goals that we might have at the international level.
Understood. Other questions people have been sending in. Where do you stand on impeachment?
I can't remember specifically, but since I announced in May of this year, I had been in favor of starting the impeachment inquiries that we're now doing. And so I think that it's important that we take a stand and have that investigative process and then ultimately a vote, so that we take a stand of ensuring that that everyone, actually falls under the rule of law, and that especially our highest office, the representation, quite frankly, the president is the standard bearer representation of all our country, and to ensure that office is held with the highest honor and the highest integrity is too important for me to have not wanted an impeachment inquiry far sooner than most everybody else, and definitely most of any of the other candidates in this congressional race.
All right, and the follow-up question to that is, the votes in the Senate don't appear to be there. Could this cost political capital, perhaps? Could this even cost the Democrats to hold on to their majority if they pursue this, knowing that the Senate would not take up an impeachment trial, or if they did, there wouldn't be the votes to actually remove the president? Do you think this could cost political capital?
I don't think that there would be a political capital issue. Not that you're right. I mean, the reality is that there might not, even though if we do impeach on the U.S. House side, we might not be able to remove on the U.S. Senate side. That's a very likely scenario. Right. And knowing that scenario, I was still supportive of the impeachment inquiries. That being said, again, because the conversation should not be about whether, what the other side is going to do. To a certain extent, at some point, you have to do the responsibility that is yours as the U.S. House, as a congressional member first.
You're right.
And second, I also don't think that there will be any worse backlash as if we did nothing. Right? Because individuals that, despite what has come out and whatever comes out during this investigation, quite frankly, may or may unlikely change their minds as to whether or not they support the current president. And I don't think that is going to change. The people that do support this current president, I don't think that's going to change whether we have an impeachment vote or not, quite frankly. I think that if we have a good message and a good conversation about the necessity to ensure that the integrity of our president is held to the highest standard, not of our current president, but just of the office of the president, right, is held to the highest standard possible. If we have that message, I think, again, that will also galvanize voters that both agree with that idea and generally voters that tend to vote for Democrats. So I don't think that there will be any worse off, let's just say, backlash because of it.
So you say the backlash that would happen the most, you think the severe backlash would occur if sat back and did nothing and didn't have an investigation, didn't have an inquiry. That would be a worse backlash, because that sort of just it basically says, well, we're going to let them operate with impunity. We're not going to do our job. That's the bit that's what I think it's what I'm getting. Am I right?
Yes, because okay. In a way, we can have this conversation with voters, right? When we go knock on doors, when we go to a forum, when we go talk to individual voters, we can have this conversation about why this is necessary. Sure. But when you come to a voter and say, well, we're not going to do anything because it might not pass on the Senate side, I don't think that mobilizes anybody, and nor does it give anyone good faith in the process or the individual that's going to stand up for what's right.
No, sure. I mean, it actually, if a person saw the House actually do their job and then saw, say, their senator not take action and refuse to hold a vote or to vote not guilty, regardless of evidence, that would energize people and certainly would energize activists, certainly, to go out there and to fight to get that senator, he or she, out of office in their next election. So it's certainly there's consequences to either action. There's consequences that are good and bad, whether that's you lose the majority or it's you don't take action and have a backlash from the voters, or you take action but you lose on the other side. That's the give and take of politics. You never. There's nothing set, nothing's permanent, especially nowadays. You don't know what it's going to be from day to day. But let's move on from impeachment, because I've only got you here for a little while longer, so I want to cover as much as we possibly can. Going out on the campaign trail, And I want to talk to you about running as a Hispanic woman, the first Hispanic woman to be elected to the Georgia legislature. How has the reaction been to your candidacy? Has it been positive? Has it been mostly positive? How's it been?
I think it has been mostly positive.
Good.
I'll start. I guess the best way to explain it is through more concrete examples of what happened with the state legislature. Quite honestly, I tell folks all the time that when people introduce me or use what I call the tagline of being the first Latina elected in the General Assembly in 2016, usually that comes with applauses, right? And I always felt really uncomfortable with that because I think that it's a pretty bad statement that in 2016 we're still talking about first, right? And so for me, it's more a reminder of that than it is. But I will tell you that over the years and over the sessions, I got a little bit more comfortable with it. I can't say that I've gotten completely comfortable, but a little bit more comfortable because honestly, it matters, especially to young folks and folks that can have someone that they identify in some way, right? And whether that's because I happen to be of Latino background or because I happen to be a female, because in many ways, because I happen to come from a background of working class family, and or sometimes, quite frankly, people have told me this too, because I happen to be younger than the average age of people that are either running for office or elected. And I have been able to have a good connection with a younger cohort of voters that have gotten engaged in the political process, that have reached out to me. And also, for example, we have a very active social media campaign, both in Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram, I tell folks, right? And we do all of these platforms because we want to engage all generational levels of potential voters. And most of the outreach that I've gotten in this capacity has been actually from, when I say young voters, I say 25 and younger, right? Individuals that are 25 and younger that have reached out precisely because they have felt some affinity in some capacity, whether because of age, because of gender, or because of ethnic background. And so I do understand in that sense how important it is. And then when I started thinking about it personally, about the individuals that have helped me throughout my process and have helped me, give me advice, resources, information, jobs, have been individuals that I did identify in some capacity, whether it was because it was an attorney that was helping me and I identified as, wanting to do that kind of job, whatever it was. And so I think about it in that context, and that's why I think that it's an important context that's going to actually have statewide impact now at the congressional level.
Right.
Because if we're going to have a representative that is representative of the communities that they serve, the 7th is the most diverse district in the Southeast, excluding Florida. Mm-hmm. There's nowhere else in the state that we need to have someone of diverse background that understands cross-culturally, not just the Hispanic community that I happen to identify with as in terms of heritage,
sure,
but we have a heavy Asian community. We have just especially with Gwinnett and Forsyth, we have people that have come from different parts of the world. I mean, the world lives here basically, and they're at different generational levels of being here, right? Whether it's first generation as myself that have naturalized citizens, or whether it's the second or third generation that have now been born in the United States and is like the children of the children. Mm-hmm. And so I think that in that context, it's vastly important to have someone that's representative of where Georgia is today.
Mm. It's certainly important for our representatives to resemble the communities that they come out of and that they're in office to represent. That is a very important issue. Obviously, I was reading some profiles of you in the paper before we reached out to your campaign to bring you on here. One paper actually quoted you as being, quote, an unapologetic liberal. What does it mean to you to be a liberal? What's your definition of being a liberal? Because to some people that's a cuss word, but I think it's just because they don't understand it. It's the Washington talking points, as you point out. But what's your definition of being a liberal?
Well, I cannot speak for however the media wants to portray me, but I will tell you who I am. And when I think of liberalism, when I think of being a Democrat, when I think of being progressive, or any of these words that you want to utilize, for me, it's love of country. Right. I do this work and I ran for office for the love that I have, first, obviously, for my state and for the county that I live, for example, but also for our country. And the fact that I personally understand how great we are and how great we can continue to be, not by providing people everything just in hand, right? But providing them the resources and opportunities. That's all I ever had. Opportunities and resources, and a lot of help from a lot of great individuals that were willing to give me advice and mentorship. And that's what allowed me to in one generation, again, be able to break from parents that continue to be working class parents that again, my father did not learn how to read or write in Spanish until he was an adult himself. Wow. And so in less than one generation, that has allowed me to continue on into grad school. Those are opportunities. And that is the story that we try to push in this country. We have, of course, a lot of bad history as well. And I don't minimize our bad history. But the only reason that we feel this country as being an aspirational country worldwide is because our constant, as we say, right, our constant pursuit for freedom, for liberty, for justice, for equality. And for me, being progressive, being liberal, being a Democrat, being any of these words that you want to call, that's what it's about.
Understood. It's a very good definition. Let me go through some more issues here with you, and we'll try to make this a lightning round. So if you can give me this one-word answers, if you can. Ending cash bail, do you support or oppose?
I support for nonviolent offenses.
Okay. On legalization of marijuana for recreational or medical use, support or oppose?
I definitely support for medical use. And I think for recreational use, I think that eventually our country will get there. But I do think that is something that we need to start working at more at a local state-to-state base.
All right. So would you vote to decriminalize marijuana?
Yes, I do support decriminalizing marijuana.
You do support that. Okay, good. On sexual assault going on around the country, what policies do you think we should implement to try to combat these issues?
Well, I think that this is a very important issue that we can focus on, and something that can be done at the federal level through grants and funding and best practices to talk to our K through 12. And ensure that we have education, that we have sufficient counselors, and that we have education about what is the way that you ensure consent, that you have a holistic sex education class that includes not only, the medical aspect of how our reproductive choices might be, but also the emotional aspect that involves, becoming sexually active adults. And I think that the way that we really combat these issues of sexual assault has to be with better education in our K through 12.
Understood. The heartbeat bill that passed, did you oppose that bill or did you support it?
I opposed that bill, and we strongly opposed it. Did a lot of advocacy work with a lot of organizations. But here's my take with that issue. The issue for me is not a conversation about pro or anti-abortion. It has nothing to do with abortion, actually. Legislation like this and any legislation similar to that is about undermining the most private and most intimate of decision making that women have to undergo. And there should be no policy that takes away the autonomy of someone to make whatever decision is best within their own religious and moral views and within their own medical history. And so for me, when I say that I support reproductive justice, that means I support women that for whatever reasons may eventually have to choose to terminate a pregnancy, or maybe it's not a choice to terminate a pregnancy, but a medical necessity. But I also support women that for whatever reasons they feel they need to carry a pregnancy to term. And we should be respectful of every decision and any decision that's taken in regards of something that's so personal and so intimate as the bearing of children.
Understood. Since this leads into healthcare, where do you stand on the Affordable Care Act? Do you support it? Do you think there's elements of it that need to be changed? Where do you stand?
I support the ACA, and I definitely know that we need to continue to improve the ACA. Obviously, I think it was a good starting point of where we were. The part that I know that we need to work on, that I would like to continue to working on, is the government option that got taken out through the negotiations. I think that regardless of what name you want to call it, again, whether you want to call it Medicare or we want healthcare for all or Americans healthcare or whatever it is that you want to call it, because I'm not stuck on the name. I'm stuck on the what we need. And what we need is universal healthcare coverage for anyone regardless of income.
And what does universal health care look like to you? What would it cover?
For me, that looks like some capacity of a government health care option. Basically, again, yes, going back to we don't have to reinvent the wheel. That's true. That could be something very similar or the same as Medicare. That could be something similar or the same as the health care coverage that congressional members have. And then it is to the choice and option of individuals to either keep their employer health care, but if they don't have employer health care or they can't afford to have health coverage in any other ways, then there should be a government option that allows for that. And you know what I tell folks, that a government healthcare option is actually the most open market way of doing business, because private insurance should have to compete with the government option that can be implemented. And so I will continue to be supportive of bills that work towards that capacity.
Would they be able to compete? Would it be a fair competition between private and government if the public option were to be adopted? Would it be fair? Would this be something that would lower prices, make things better, do you think?
I think it would be fair. I definitely, the prices would be reduced, but that is the market, right? It is precisely, again, I think that if private insurances have good insurance coverage, or employers want to attract the best employees and they give good health insurance that has good coverage, and they're subsidizing some of that cost for their employers, or wholly subsidizing the cost for their employers because they're seeking the best and the most talented, then I think that then yes, it actually opens up to be one of the best ways to ensure that we have a good competitive market.
All right. This is a big one. You went to college, you went to grad school, you went to law school. Not cheap. And this is a big battle with a lot of students. Student loan debt is over $1 trillion now. A lot of students are calling for debt forgiveness, to have their debt canceled. You worked hard. Your parents worked hard and you had to sacrifice, I'm sure, to get through school and to pay those loans if you had to take out any. And do you think that we need to, in essence, cancel this out? Is there, or what alternatives do you think we should adopt in order to address the student loan crisis? Because this is going to get worse if we don't take action now. It can only get worse. This is the natural progress of things.
I do agree that can only get worse. And full disclosure, for law school, actually, I had to take on a lot of loans, because I tell folks that's the quote unquote way I could pay for law school, right? That's the only way I could afford to go to law school if I wanted to.
Sure.
And so I do understand personally what that means, and the fact that I will have student loans for the rest of my life otherwise, right? So that being said, because personally, I understand that I do support student loan forgiveness, right? And especially as it is based on income earned. Once you graduate, right? Once you graduate out of your program.
Explain that a little bit more if you can for the viewers. Based on income earned. So this is what income you'll earn with that degree, or where does the income come from?
Yes, what income you're earning post graduation from your degree, right?
Okay, gotcha.
So I think that I see the debt forgiveness to be somewhat on the sliding scale, based on your income earned post your graduation, and so to a certain point, be able to completely remove debt, and also for people, for example, that choose to go into public or public interest areas, whether that's government work or whether that is attorneys that do, for example, nonprofit law or work with nonprofit service agencies. Obviously, for individuals that go into much needed areas such as teaching, or those that stay at a substantial number of years in the rural areas. Like, for example, here in Georgia, we have a heavy need for doctors in outside of Metro Atlanta, basically.
Sure.
And so I could agree with having different ways at which beyond the just the income, right? Beyond the sliding scale income.
So it sounds like you're describing there. It'd be if you're willing to, quote, sign a contract with your country, whether if you go into teaching, you go into working in nonprofit work, you go into some form of government service or civil service, then it would help alleviate your debt after a certain number of years served. Is that that's I think it's what I'm hearing from you.
Yes, and I say that in addition to the sliding scale of income earned. So
okay.
not one or the other, but in addition to.
Yeah, so you have both. So you have both options right there.
That's right.
Yeah, one solution doesn't solve everything, of course, and that's certainly something that needs to be looked at and needs to be addressed sooner rather than later. On some other issues that are facing Georgia, you mentioned agriculture earlier with the farmers and the aid that y'all had to go into and approve during the special session of the state legislature. Where do you stand on these tariffs that are really hurting the American farmer, not just here in Georgia, but across the country? Would you support repealing these tariffs and giving the farmers some more aid to get through this, since they're now operating in the red?
Well, I do support repealing the tariffs. I disagreed with the tariffs, and again, this is very unfortunate because this is our connection of our domestic policies as they relate to globalized economy that we live in. Correct?
Yes.
And so I think that it was poorly thought to have done these things. I think that we've had really good working relationships with a lot of the other governments in regards to some of our trade issues. Now, I think there's lots of ways that we can fix or improve our negotiations, for example, to ensure that there is less impact to our local economies. That's for certain. But again, you don't eliminate something outright to solve an issue that can be solved by just maneuvering a certain section, right, or changing a certain section. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, I definitely support repealing these tariffs.
Okay, all right. And do you think that Georgia is moving more towards becoming a swing state? I've asked this of a couple of other politicians I've had on. Do you see Georgia moving in that direction?
Well, I guess for me, it's a little bit hard because I think it really is localized to certain areas where we've seen far more movement. But as a state as a whole, I do believe that, we are definitely purple, right? I think that is where we are today. The difference in the issue for me is, can we motivate individuals to come out and vote that haven't otherwise voted? Because if we do that, I think that we're going to start sliding more away from the purple and into the blue. But as we stand today, I think that we're definitely, as a state as a whole, definitely in that middle section of purple.
Okay. And another person asked, where do you stand on the on Confederate monuments and on Stone Mountain? Do you support removing these monuments and changing Stone Mountain?
Again, I think that this is something that we need to have more of a conversation at the local level. I guess on a globalized sense, I do believe that the Confederacy flag, for example, should not have a home in public property, whatever sort of public property that is. And so I definitely, and those are two separate issues from the Stone Mountain. The Stone Mountain is the one that I think that, it's a local conversation that we need to continue to have. But definitely in terms of the Confederate flag, that is something that does not belong on private property. And here's the thing.
It doesn't belong on public property.
On public property, that's correct.
Yeah, I'm about to say, hold on a minute. On private property, it's the private owner's business what they put on their property, right?
Exactly. On private property, it is private, and each person can put up whatever it is that they so choose.
Right, exactly. Okay.
but for public property, they have no space in that. That does not, again, by doing so, and again, this is why conversations are so important. By doing so, there is no reason why we cannot have a historical context about what it meant and what we were, what happened. And again, the facts that come with that, right? It was an intent to secede from the country,
right?
And again, so I consider myself a Georgian, and I consider myself a Southerner.
Yeah.
And
we don't have to go. We don't have to go into the history of the whole thing here at this time.
Exactly. So I consider myself a Georgian and a Southerner. But I can be proud of that. But that does not vis-a-vis immediately equate to the Confederacy.
No, you're absolutely right. You can be proud of being a part of your state, and you can love your state. That doesn't mean you have to love every part of your state's history. It doesn't matter if you're in Georgia, New York, Alabama, wherever you're at. But on this conversation, this brings up, and this will be my final question because we're out of time. On terms of conversation, there's an organization that reached out to the show here. It's called the Constitute Voice, and it's an LLC located in Metro Atlanta, and they're hosting an event called Coffee with Candidates, and it allows candidates that are running for local, state, and federal office to come out and to meet with voters from all over the metro area and from even the rural areas, and just ask questions of the candidates and talk to them in a frank and open and honest manner. And this is an apolitical organization. They will have Republicans, Democrats, Independents, Libertarians. Anybody is welcome to come out and talk. Their first event's going to be next month in November. Would you participate in something like that and actually come out and talk to voters and have a frank conversation about health care, about Confederate memorials, about gun rights, and all that?
I like to participate in anywhere that I'm invited. As a matter of fact, precisely, again, going back to why I think it is important to have these smaller conversations with individual people able to ask questions directly. I personally actually have monthly what I call Bagels with Brenda. And so it's a monthly meeting throughout the different cities of the district, precisely so we can have that more personal, more intimate conversation and people can ask me questions one-on-one. So please feel free to tell them to send me an invite with time, date, and location. And so long as I don't have a calendar conflict, I'm always happy to go anywhere that I'm asked to attend.
I'd be happy to do that for you. Would they need to go through your campaign, or would they need to go through your state office? How would they? So I make sure I get the right information. Through the campaign?
Through the campaign, yes. It's for candidate purposes.
Okay, gotcha. Understood. All right. Well, Brenda, it has been a pleasure to have you here on the show. We are out of time. I have enjoyed it. I hope you'll come back again. We can have another longer conversation if you'd like about any issues. Best of luck out there on the campaign trail, and hope you'll come back again. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise, thank you for having me, and definitely we'll have another chat in the near future. Sounds
good. All right, everyone. That is State Representative Brenda Lopez Romero running for the Georgia 7th Congressional District. She will be back again. We've heard her, and we've heard the commitment. If you're interested in the Coffee with Candidates event, go to www.constitutevoice.com. We'll post a link in the description of this video, and you can find out time, date, and location, and we'll see if we can get Representative Romero to come out to that event. And we're also going to have some other candidates that are running for office in the state of Georgia. So by all means, check that out. And this has been the Free Speech Zone. I'm your host, Eric Barnard, and I'll see you next time.